was thinking about, well, how do you introduce? I have the rare pleasure of introducing Dr. Harris. Then I thought, well, how do you introduce someone who is such a legend in every way? And then I thought, well, I'm not going to take a lot of time with the introduction, but I'll just highlighting just a few things. And then I will share with you a little about how we were so very fortunate to get her to agree to speak with us. Um, one, I mean, how do you introduce an individual who is, as I indicate, so highly accomplished? She's a New York Times bestseller, you know that. She's an author, editor, translator of 18 books or more, you know that. Her book, How on the Hog, was the basis for the Netflix documentary that I think all of us were just so tremendously, was most inspiring. But our next speaker up, actually, Marianne Loa Martin, mentioned about her excellent French. And I think that was so obvious that she was definitely a leader herself across the African diaspora, had language capabilities, which so many of us don't have or use appropriately. So that was inspiring. And she has, I think this was another thing, you know, New Orleans is, as you well know, it's a foodie city for certain. And she has two James Beard Awards, I think, and there are only, I think, two black women, I believe, two black women, I believe, that have that award. Lifetime Achievement Award, yes, the Lifetime Achievement Award, and that is, so, so I mean, it's just everything. But when I think when Dr. Freddie Hill is here, I had, and she knew Dr. Harris, and I was like, you know, we really would like to invite her to speak because so many of our teachers actually talk about ways in which they utilize both her book and the How on the Hog documentary to introduce the African diaspora culture to their students. So now I need to make clear so that you understand, it's the African Diaspora Consortium that develops the content, the African diaspora content to be used with AP seminars. So we you know, find outstanding leaders across different topics and themes and countries to help us ensure that. And so when I was so nervous about email, I think, didn't I, Dr. Harris, I wrote a long text trying to explain you know, what we had in common and something. And she was so gracious to write back and say that this was one area that moved her enough that she would be interested in joining us for this experience. So it is my pleasure, honor to present Dr. Jessica Harris.
Lordy. Good morning. How are you all? And yeah, come on now. I ain't that kind of legend. Okay, the other thing is that what I think Dr. Freeman was trying to remind you of was that my James Beard Lifetime Achievement Award was the second one given to an African American woman. The first one went to New Orleans's Mrs. Leah Chase. So, all praises due where due. When I walked in, it was kind of like old home week. I'm gonna, you know, lèse majesté, the great French term when you do less to the king than you should. I am going to probably be guilty of it because I'm gonna say, Betty, Freddie, Tony, hey. It was my singular honor many moons ago, BK, which in New Orleans stands for Before Katrina, to be the inaugural professor in the Ray Charles Chair in African American Material Culture with a specialty in food and folklore, which has now morphed into the Ray Charles program at Dillard University when Dr. Betty Parker Smith had the helm. She's the one who interviewed me, so thank you, and I miss y'all. Um, I'm gonna go back and forth with a few languages for a minute. Je viens de trouver une nouvelle sœur. I have just found a new sister, Mariema Loum Martin. We actually share somebody that I consider to be so close to be my son. So we share a gentleman named Yadan Israel, who is actually Black American, and she lives in Marrakech, a town that I adore. This is gonna waddle, okay. Donc, bienvenue chez moi et merci, so welcome and thank you. And finally, regarding High on the Hog, y'all were good. Y'all were so good it got a second season. The black people gonna get free. Okay. And it handles pretty much the second half of the book and deals with the African American food from emancipation through the present day. So it's tackling a lot of hard topics, but a little bit of those hard topics with people who actually lived them. So you no longer have talking heads talking about history, you have the talking heads who made the history talking. So it'll be interesting to see what that has to do. Most of you know me through High on the Hog, and I would opine that most of you don't know that I spent 50 years, that's not 1-5, that's 50, laboring in the academic fields, okay? I taught first French, and then remedial English and English literature in the SEEK program, which is a higher education opportunity program. So the students that we had, or that I had, probably overlap your AP students, and not always in a good way. But I taught in the SEEK program, which is a higher education opportunity program at Queens College CUNY in New York City. So, over those years, I developed multiple strategies for connecting students to the history of the African diaspora, even though it wasn't my job, and I'm old enough so that I know that when I started the job, the term African diaspora wasn't even used. So, I hope to talk about some of that later in the Q&A, but right now, I'd like to take you, hopefully briefly, but I'm already looking at time going, oh, this is not gonna work, through a culinary journey from Africa to this hemisphere in what I hope will be close to 30 minutes. So let's start. Sea changes. On Juneteenth of this year, I found myself on what is known as Inkwell Beach on Martha's Vineyard Island, leading a group of African Americans in a ceremony honoring the ancestors at the water's edge. I spoke of water and of the role that water has played in our lives, from the water that carried our ancestors to these shores, to the amniotic fluid that nurtures us during gestation. We have all undergone what African American poet Robert Hayden has called a sea change. In his poem, The Middle Passage, he talks about doing this, doing a mighty jazz riff on Ariel's speech from The Tempest. And he says, deep in festering hold thy father lies. Of his bones, New England pews are made. Those are altar lights that were his eyes. Nothing that was his doth fade, but suffers a sea change into something rich and strange. Now, Africans in diaspora in the American hemisphere have indeed undergone a sea change, one that has wrought us wondrous strange indeed. Our sea change, by riffing and signifying, bending and breaking established norms, has also absolutely enriched the culture not only of this country, but of the hemisphere in immeasurable ways that are only now, in the third decade of the 21st century, beginning to be truly admitted and investigated. And now I'm going to preach to the choir for a second, and forgive me. Some of you probably use this. It is called, and it's too far. Okay, let's go back. It's called The Slave Trade in 2 Minutes. If you're not familiar with it, it is online. So there you go. Top numbers, dates. Each dot is a slave ship. It's based on the numbers coming from the Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade by Eltis and Richardson, and I know some scholars have difficulty with its numbers, but the information as to the origins of the ships and the destinations of captives is especially useful in a discussion of diaspora, because the cultural connections become flagrant when the enslaved country of origin becomes part of the discussion. So, you can see how those dots are progressing. And see where they go. We talk about this transatlantic slave trade, but this is the thing that I have found that makes it viscerally apprehended by anybody who watches it. Okay, we're still not at the point of being the US, as you know. Okay, just made it. Fall of the Bastille, and so on and so forth. And that last little blip that got in there was, as you know, the Clotilda, which is the one that Zora Neale Hurston writes about in Barracoon. Consider then that from 1668 to 1829, of the 140,000 enslaved shipped out of the port of Saint Louis de Senegal, 41,000 went to Saint Domingue, read Haiti and the Dominican Republic. 36,000 went to the Eastern Caribbean, including 5,000 to Dominica, 7,800 to Martinique, 5,100 to Guadeloupe. In the continental United States, 10,000 went to Charleston and 5,700 to the Gulf Coast, probably entering through Mobile or New Orleans. Between 1727 and 1863, 582,000 were shipped out of the Dahomean port of Ouida. Of them, some 175,000 went to Hispaniola, again, Haiti. 43,000 to Martinique, 11,000 to Guadeloupe, 24,200 to Salvador de Bahia, Brazil, 9,600 to Pernambuco, 2,600 to America's Gulf Coast, and 37,000 to the Cuban ports of Havana and Matanzas. This, then, is the common genesis of our culinary cultures in Africa's diaspora in this American hemisphere. And just to remind us, in my cookbook, Beyond Gumbo, Creole Fusion Food from the Atlantic Rim, I categorized several tendencies that I felt distinguish the foods of the Creole world of this African Atlantic Rim, and indeed conjoin the foods of the diaspora. They include the use of leafy greens, the abundant use of okra, and if you watched High on the Hog, you know I have it on my stationery and business card. A preference for rice and an extensive rice kitchen, and those are rice enslaved folks working rice in South Carolina. A mastery of frying in deep oil. We don't shallow fry, we don't saute, but we can deep fat fry with the best of them. Okay, and those are cuchifritos, fried things, hueyes, land crabs, and carne, meat in Puerto Rico. The use of nuts as thickeners, and here, were there world enough and time, we could talk about the song Eatin' Goober Peas and the fact that goobers that we use, if you go to the movies or used to go to the movies and buy those goobers, those boxes, Africanism that you didn't even know about, goobers, from the Bantu languages in which peanuts or ground nuts are nguba. So, goober peas, an Africanism. Use of seasoning pastes like sofritos and Bajan seasonings, and since we're in New Orleans, I'm going to include roux, although folks will disagree with me. The use of hot sauce as condiments. We don't necessarily have spicy food, but we always have a little something on the side to make it spicy. So it's a condiment, it's an add-in, it's an add-on. Our food is well seasoned, but it's not necessarily peppery hot. Up until very, very recently, and still a tell, if you will, the use of pig and pig parts. And this was a lechon, roasted suckling pig in Puerto Rico, and the use of dried and smoked ingredients as seasonings. Think not only that ham hock, but think about smoked cod, think about saltfish, think about all of those things. Confections using nuts and particularly coconuts, pecans, peanuts, Brazil nuts, fruit pastes, and cane sugar. New Orleans, I always contend, culturally is the northernmost point in the Caribbean. Church said amen on that one. Okay. So it is, if you think about it culturally, because it is part of cane culture, sugarcane culture, and everything that happened with sugarcane. And lastly, a preponderance of professional women cooks and the importance of women cooks. So today, arguably, since I'm already out of time, I'd like to present three of them. First of all, leafy greens. Sosfeuille, sauce gombo, supicanya, and the young lady from Senegal, Nangadef. Tracing this dish begins on the West African coast with dishes like Senegal's supicanya and the various sosfeuille and sauce gombo of the République du Bénin. In the French-speaking Caribbean, kalalou is a dish of chopped leafy greens that are whipped until frothy and served with okra, crab, and shrimp. Kalaloo is also given to the leaves of the plants which go into the dish. However, there are many different plants that go by the name kalaloo, as your ethnobotanist husband would know, Madame Lou Martin. However, the name kalaloo can also include the taro plant, taro being a Native American tuber that can be called kalaloo sometimes. A similar dish is eaten in northeastern Brazil under the name of caruru. And in the English-speaking islands, the dish is also known as kalaloo, spelled differently. And in Tobago, it is a verdant green soup, sometimes known as pepper pot. And there's this amazing north-south confusion of things where what becomes pepper pot in Tobago and Jamaica then becomes kalaloo elsewhere. So you've got all of that. Kalaloo, because it also contains okra quite often, is a representation that serves to illustrate two of those tendencies, the use of leafy greens and the abundant use of okra. In Curacao, there's an okra-based soup based on the leafy green soup called quiambo, and they're just FYI. Portuguese word for okra is quiabo, so it's really a sort of brief elision of quiabo into quiambo, and it's no surprise when you consider that the early Dutch settlers of Curacao were probably Jewish conversos who had left the Iberian Peninsula, migrated to Pernambuco in northeastern Brazil, and from there into Curacao. Curacao is also the home of the oldest, if I'm not mistaken, and it's the adjectives that will clear it, the oldest continuously operating synagogue in the Western Hemisphere, Mikveh Israel, which is Sephardic, not Ashkenaz, and that's an important distinction, but definitely no time for that. Then there are okra and leafy green soups, both in Cuba and Puerto Rico, going under the names of sopa de quimbombo. In the Dominican Republic, a similar soup is known as sopa de malondron. Don't ask me why it's malondron in the Dominican Republic. I think people just being contrary. The line continues to move into the United States via New Orleans, and there is a little twist here. There is equally a Senegalese antecedent for this dish of leafy greens and okra as well. It is called soupi kanya, and is a soupy stew from the southern region of Senegal, which is known as the Casamance. It is a rich broth filled with seafood, crab, vegetables, and okra. Okra is the kanya that gives the soupi kanya its name. The church is saying amen from I see in a head nod. While the origin may see Senegalese, gumbo takes its name from the Bantu languages of West Central Africa, in which okra is called ochingombo or kingombo, terms that are retained with little variation in the words kimbombo, used for okra in parts of the Hispanic Caribbean to this day. In New Orleans, the term gombo is thought, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself, but it's okay, is thought to have come from those Bantu origins as well. But the leafy green soup does not stop there. It moves northward. In Charleston, South Carolina, they serve a thin, ruleless okra soup that is also called a gumbo. If you remember back to the days when Campbell's Soups was making a wider variety, they had a chicken gumbo. That was based on the South Carolina gumbo, not obviously, for those of you who know New Orleans, not on the New Orleans one. In colonial and federal Philadelphia, women of West African origin hawked what was initially called Philadelphia gumbo on the streets of that city. Often it was made with what was called frou-frou dumplings, but when you look at it a little closer, you realize that frou-frou dumplings were really fufu dumplings, and it goes back to Western Africa in that sense. And I'm going to jump rather cruelly, you don't need to know, but the whole idea is Philadelphia's gumbo becomes pepper pot. Remember that north-south confusion with the callaloo and the pepper pot? Philadelphia's gumbo morphs into Philadelphia's pepper pot, and if you are as old as I am, you remember the old original bookbinders in Philly, and you'd go to Philly, and the one thing you had to do was go to bookbinders and have pepper pot. It became the classic totemic soup of the city. Okay, the southern portion of Senegal is a rice-growing and rice-eating area. The country's national dish, cheboujen, is a red rice dish cooked with fish and vegetables, carrots, eggplant, and more. Today, it is reddened with tomato paste. So when you were in Dakar and you were wondering why there were those towers of tomato paste in the market, that's why, because it's used for cheboujen. Some suggest that pre the Columbian Exchange, and I'm going to talk about that just briefly in a minute, when the New World tomato did not exist on the African continent, the dish might have been reddened with palm oil, red palm oil. Others suggest that it's simply a creolized dish that originates post-Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange is basically this, a little out of focus, but the ebb and flow of foodstuffs that happened after Columbus got lost. Okay. So well, there's a wonderful Trinidadian calypso that goes, Columbus, lie, 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 he lie. Okay, hint for classes. So you get things like all of the solanaceae, all of the tomatoes, well, not the eggplants, but the tomatoes, the peppers going from the New World to the Old World, and then other things. Imagine, if you will, somebody was telling me he was a certified barbecue judge. Well, there were no pigs in the New World until after the Columbian Exchange. Europeans brought pigs. Imagine Italy. No tomatoes until the Columbian Exchange. Imagine Germany or Ireland, no potatoes until the Columbian Exchange. And so you can see that this thing that is now gone beyond taking its name from Columbus, who got lost, to being called a world in transition. And so this world, our world globally, was in transition extraordinarily in terms of its agriculture, in terms of just how and what people ate. Thai food, no chilies, all of that, Colombian exchange and the world in transition. So, Chebujen is a composed rice dish that has been taken to the hearts and stomachs of most of West Africa, where it is also known as Jollof rice, in honor of the Jollof Empire of the Wolof of Senegal. So either as Chebujen or as Jollof rice, it crossed the Atlantic to enter in the ports of Charleston and New Orleans, especially. Remember those shipping figures from earlier, where it was transformed into two different dishes. Charleston's red rice and New Orleans jambalaya. Okay? Rice is a major connector of the African diaspora in the New World. Rice planters in the Carolina Low Country expressed a preference for enslaved workers from the rice growing regions in Western Africa, and you can find online those slave sale posters recently arrived from the Windward Coast, coded language. These people know what they're doing with rice. We don't, so let's go get them. Okay? Those in New Orleans and southern Louisiana could also claim to have had in general compass a Senegambian genesis. If you read Gwendolyn Midlo Hall's work, you can find that the early people in southern Louisiana were basically Senegambian and Beninois, or Dahomean, if you will. They came out of those ports. Didn't necessarily mean they were from there, but it usually means that they were close to there. These and other derivative rice dishes turned up in the tables of the Low Country's big houses and have become a part of the general foodways of that region. They are also pervasive throughout the African Atlantic world. The Charleston purloo, purloo being a Low Country word for a pilau or pilaf, known as hoppin' is one example of those composed rice dishes. This time one using the African field pea, black-eyed peas, lady peas, in this case, black-eyed peas. I once did an op-ed for the Times, and I said black-eyed peas and hoppin' John. I got more letters from Charlestonians. It's like, no, you didn't. No, we don't. So the pea can be somewhat contentious, but the bottom line is a lot of people use black-eyed peas. And in fact, the black-eyed pea is African in origin. So there is a Senegalese black-eyed pea pilau called chebu nyebe, nyebe simply meaning black-eyed pea, and cheb meaning rice. And it bears a startling resemblance to hoppin' John, with the exception that it uses lamb instead of pork. Beyond the United States, there is also a hemispheric-wide conjoining of rice and beans in a variety of ways. So much so that in much of the Hispanic world, a dish of beans and white rice is simply known as la bandera, the flag. Finally, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself again. All right, sorry about that. Finally, there is the red beans and rice dish simply known as riz national in Haiti, and it is considered to be the traditional Monday dinner in New Orleans. Louis Armstrong loved it so much that he signed his letters, red beans and ricely yours. He had a coda to it, then Bismarex and something, something. And I always wondered what it was. And finally, because the Armstrong archives before they moved back to his house were actually located at Queens College, I went in and found out that Bismarex was a laxative. So he had a whole lot of stuff going on with his red beans and rice. Equally, there is a Cuban dish known as moros y cristianos, the Moors and the Christians, black beans and white rice. And its variant, sometimes with black beans, sometimes with red beans, called congri. And Chef Leah Chase, who grew up in St. Martinville, if I'm not mistaken. Sorry? Madisonville. I know it started with an M and ended with a Ville. I was close. Madisonville. When I mentioned congri to her, she said, yeah, we used to eat it. We used to eat congri. Congri. Congri with rice. Okay? And finally, we're going to end up with a little bit of sweet, the praline or prasle de cacahuatl, cacahuatl being The Nahuatl term for peanut, they originate on this hemisphere, tablet de coco or pe de moleque, or simply a peanut patty. Okay, sorry it had to be shot through. I was too cheap to buy it, so I had to shoot it through plastic. This is a New World edition, all of those sweets, to the diasporic culinary lexicon. It is certainly center stage as New Orleans' primary candy, whether it is a praline or a praline, God help you, or for many, many of the African Americans who were the candy makers, it was simply known as pecan candy. And please, pecan, not pecan. Rude joke about that, which I will not tell. But the thing is that it was often a source for extra income for women and young girls up to the present time. If you drive around my neighborhood, you see somebody with a truck and the back is down and there's a sign that says pecan candy, and you got it, pecan candy. It leaves us with a bit of sweetness in our mouth and with yet another of our many culinary connections across the African Atlantic world and back to the African continent. So, those are some fancy ones. And monkey meat is just another nut patty. It's not made from monkeys, okay? It's a Charleston thing. So, despite our varying points of departure and our multiple points of arrival, the okra on our plates and the sea changes our food has undergone show us that there is more that joins us than that separates us. I've mentioned only 3 of the culinary threads that connect the African Atlantic world, and those not in particularly great detail. There are so many, many, many more. For despite varying colonial cultures and linguistic variations, at bedrock, there is just so much that joins us to each other. And we are indeed culinary cousins and cultural cousins. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Okay, I think it's on.
Thank you so very much. And now, as I said from the beginning, we've all said this is all teacher run. So we have one of our teachers, Andrew Githers, Bedford Academy in Brooklyn, New York, who is going to moderate this discussion. And then we'll have just a few minutes for Q&A.
Hello, neighbor. How are you doing today? So, I'm a huge fan. When I saw your book, High in the Hog, I immediately had to get it. I've read it backward and forward. I've even watched the Netflix documentary series. It was like, oh, she talked about that. It was on this page and stuff like that. So, it's a complete honor that I can get to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much.
One of my questions is that, so as you see, we're filled room with teachers, and one of our biggest things is try to encourage our students to pursue passion projects with this course, with the AP seminar. So when they come up with their original research questions, we encourage them that they should be passionate about their particular project, and so they have the greatest opportunity to learn about their particular subject. So my question to you is, why was writing High in the Hog so important for you?
Oh, goodness. Can you hear me? Okay. High on the Hog, well, it was important and it wasn't important. It was another book, but it was important simply because what the little notes that come above a recipe in a cookbook are called the head notes. And what I had noticed was that the head notes were getting longer and longer and longer. I also have to add, I hate writing recipe. I don't cook with them. I hate writing them. I don't ever want to write another one, which is a problem because I'm in the middle of finishing up a cookbook. So that's a little difficult. But the point simply being the head notes sort of demanded that they become a text. And I was very fortunate that I had, at that point, found an editor, Catherine Belden, who said, yeah, you're not a cookbook writer. You are a writer, and I'm going to take this on. And so we worked, I cried a lot. I think there were 15 drafts, but we got it done.
Okay. So I want to shift a little in terms of talking about like food culture, right? Because like I love food, and like just considering who seems to dominate these conversations about foods, it often gets me to wonder like how do we start to like get into those spaces? So for example, when you think about food, you think about like Food Network and Bon Appetit magazine, and you think the James Beard Foundation. But like as you said earlier, there's only been like two black women who has been acknowledged for their work within food, and even within the Michelin Guide, there's only four black chefs that have Michelin stars. So my question is, how do we start to navigate those spaces so we can see more African food traditions in those particular spaces, so we can start to change the conversation that's had about like food?
Okay, several things. See if I can remember it all. Usually I come up with a pad so I can take notes when somebody is asking a question because I don't always remember it. But anyhow, the spaces are changing. I actually hosted the James Beard Leadership Awards this year, and the person who oversees the awards, all of them, is Dawn Padmore. Padmore is a Liberian American. Okay. There have been, if you follow James Beard, enormous amounts of kerfuffle, I'll just leave it at that, about the awards, who gets them, how they get them, and so on and so forth. I just attended I don't know that it's particularly well-named event, but it's a great event, and it's an event that speaks to what's happening on Martha's Vineyard. It celebrates women chefs of color. It's called The King is Dead, meaning the old white boys with those big high hats are gone. But I think that the thing is, with all of that, the world is changing. I also think build your own. What are the Black Food Awards? And what happens with them? Who goes to those restaurants? Who supports what? What are we talking about? Are we talking about adopting the Beard standards, or Lord help us all, the Michelin standards? Where you have to have this kind of glassware and it has to be set that way and all of the rest of that. It's fine. I am as much a fan of a white tablecloth, fabulous service restaurant as anybody. But in the immortal words of the Peggy Lee song, is that all there is? So I think that we don't need to just step into something and say, well, it may have worked for y'all, now we want to make it work for us. We are way too inventive as a people to not do our own thing. So that would be part of my answer. Did I get most of those
Yeah,
questions?
you got most of it. You definitely got most of it. So again, we're teachers in the room. Some of us have the book. Some of us have your other books. So how do you imagine like teachers adopting some of your writings inside their classrooms?
Okay, well, several things. First of all, those 50 years, by the time I got to like year 35, it was like, bad, ugly headline, teacher in tower with Uzi. And I decided, okay, how am I going to switch this so I can find the absolute joy that I find in teaching? And I decided I was going to use food. Food is a lingua franca. I don't know about your AP students, but my remedial students were always in spaces where it was never good enough. Someone always knew more than they did, and they were always somewhere in the back of the bus going. Food is a subject on which everyone is expert. Everyone. And no one, you like it. No one can say, no, you don't like it. You like it. So you're an expert. So using food gave my students power in the classroom. What I did, and certainly for the first decade of that, God, I'm old, was I came up with a series of exercises, all of them ending in essays. Remember, I taught writing. And they had prompts, so they had things to read and then would write. What is the fruit of your childhood? Okay, think about it. What is the fruit that you most connect with your childhood? Okay, for some of us it's grapes, for some of it's watermelon, for some of us it's apples, for some of it's peaches. I had a lot of students from the Caribbean. Trust me, it was mangoes. You have all of that. Some people it was dragon fruit and things I hadn't even heard of. But when you look at that, then phase 2, research it, write a 2-page essay on it. And there was something that they worked out of that prompted that. What is your favorite family recipe? And that involved research. So they had to go speak to an elder. And I said, you may not talk to your mom or your grandma, but Aunt so-and-so or Miss so-and-so who lives up the block, you talk to her, go talk to her. So they would get the history of a family recipe and write that out as research. Anyhow, there were about 10 of them, maybe 15, it depended on the number of weeks in the semester, so probably 12. And what they then did at the end of the semester was they transformed it into a book. Each essay became a chapter. Each chapter had to have an epigraph. And they bound it as a book, they dedicated it as a book, they could illustrate it with photos, with artwork, with whatever. And I got some of the most extraordinary things from students, all out of food. Okay, so it was writing their memoir, but it was their culinary memoir. And we read culinary memoir in class as well, so all of that.
All right, last question. And this is something that teachers like me and other teachers who are on the front line have to deal with this every day. So our current political climate seems to demonize the stories that are told that are told out of your work and the stories that we try to teach in our classes. So what kind of words of encouragement would you give us to continue the work that we're doing in class, even in a world where we're getting such a visceral reaction to those stories?
Several things. That's one of the reasons I got on a plane and came down here. So let me say that right now. I don't do New Orleans. I actually have a house here, which I am not staying in because everything is wrapped in plastic and up high. It's hurricane season. I would say that what people must do, have to do, is pretty much keep your eye on the prize. It's not an option to not do. I stopped teaching because I'm old, but I like to think that I still teach with lectures and everything else. So it's discouraging. It's soul deadening at some points. But because every time you say there are teachers in the room, it's like, me too, longer than all of y'all. We can't give up. We can't give up. If you start thinking about ancestors, people have gone through a whole lot more than, this is a blip compared to what our ancestors went through. And it's about preparing folks to handle the onslaught and the tidal wave of crap that's probably coming, and being able to know that some of us are righteous, and maybe the righteous among us can stick together and sustain each other enough so that we can get through it.
Thank you for your time. I truly enjoyed this moment.
Oh, thank you. I speak very loudly, so. Dr. Harris, first of all, thank you so much for your work. I just published my first book about African American herbalism last year. My publisher gave me 6 months to produce this thing, and your work really got me through and pushed me over to keep telling the stories. So what would you suggest about all of us trying to preserve our own legacies and really uplift the messages of our ancestors about these rites of passage, and being able to either record them, record the elders, or produce content with those?
Okay, some of it I think I just said. She said as a school teacher, but I'm thinking that experiences. How many of you have your students do oral research? I mean, oral research is something that has always been poo-pooed for, oh no, it's like, no, we are people of the word. African Americans in diaspora are people of the word. If you don't believe that, yesterday was the 50th anniversary of hip hop. We are word magicians. We are people of the word. And because we are people of the word, we are not necessarily, as the Jewish people proclaim themselves to be, people of the book. But what we need to do is start getting some of those words into the book, or into our books. The epigraph to the book after the book I'm going to do, hopefully by September, is from Stevland Morris, better known to y'all as Little Stevie Wonder, who said, "You better tell your story well, because if you lie, it will come to pass." That's on us. We must tell our stories. We can't depend on anybody else. The young lady from Senegal, you know, Cheikh Anta Diop, university is named for him for a reason. He exists in English translation. All of those folks of that generation, you know, from Fanon to Senghor to Damas and beyond, held their line. It's up to us. We got to hold ours.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Harris. Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. I have not yet read your book, but I am fascinated by your recipes, your melange of vegetables and spices and foodstuffs. My question is, how do we get the young, our students, to become more cognizant of not only the flavors involved and the diasporic elements in our food, but the nutritional value of our food? Because too many of our youth today, and even us as adults, but we're focused here as teachers on the youth and the next generation, eat quite poorly. How do we get them to understand that this food not only tastes good, but has, in some measure, excellent educational and rather nutritional value, and will serve, if eaten properly, as medicine and preventative medicine for their bodies, hearts, and minds?
Okay, that's a hard one. Again, I think that there are questions, and real questions, about the role of the teacher. I have raised more students. I don't have any kids. I had everybody's kid. Okay? I think that the thing becomes looking at ways across the board. You probably are not going home with those kids. You probably may or may not have at your institution facilities where they can even cook. So the question becomes, how do you do what you do? And what I think is, if you spark curiosity, and that is a teacher's job, if you spark a necessity almost to learn, to understand, to change. Nobody wants to be preached at. I eat as much fried pork rind as I can find, okay? I know it's not good for me. It's what I do. I like it. It's a choice. I mean, some of your students are gonna be right there too. I think that some ways we not necessarily overstep, but let's do what we can do well. And that is let them know what's going on and why it's wrong and what will the consequences be. But if you live in one of those, I hate the term food deserts, but if you live in one of those arid zones where the only thing you got is the bodega on the corner or a cab ride, there are other problems at foot. There are other things at foot. If you've never seen a green vegetable, there are other things. There are other questions and other things that probably come out of and around with that. So there are more problems. There are things that people can work with. Where do you teach? Upstate New York? Okay, so you live where there are farmers. Okay, take them to the farmers market. Take them to the farmers market, work with the farmers, get a farmer to come in and do a presentation. What does he grow? Why does he grow it? How does he grow it? What's available? How to cook it? And where can they get it? That would be step one. Because half the time, folks don't even know what it is. It's like, arugula? What's that? You know? So, I mean, I think that those things become questions that are very real. And you can't eat, you can't change, you can't clear up a problem if you don't even know anything about the potential solution. What is out there? What do you eat? What can you eat? You know, have something, do a tasting. Do a tasting. If you are up for it and want to do something like that, parents, depending on what grade level you're teaching, some kids are being fed Kentucky Fried by their parents. It's not that they want to eat it, it's what they get. And they get it because mom's too busy to cook. She can't get to the store but so often. And all of the rest of that chains and makes for unhealthy eating. But the thing to remember is, let's not demonize our traditional food, okay? We are the only people in the world who demonize our traditional food. You know, it's not right. Our food comes out of a particular experience that many of us are very uncomfortable with. Okay? You have to understand, or one must understand, that our food comes out of a condition that was imposed on us. It wasn't one we chose. And so if you go back to the continent, and even there, colonialism hasn't necessarily made it better. if you go back to the continent and look at the kinds of things that were eaten before, which is where history and food intersect, that piece of meat in the greens was a tiny little seasoning piece of meat. It wasn't 5 ham hocks and yesterday's leftover ham. Okay? That is the result of prosperity that came with emancipation when people said, I couldn't, now I'm gonna. It was also a diet of laborers. If you got up every morning at dawn, you know, what is it, from can to can? If you got up every morning at can and worked till half can before you got to eat again, you needed that food. You needed that to sustain you in what you did. And so when you now get up and slide your ever-widening backside into your BMW to drive 5 blocks to your job, it's gonna kill you. And they just need to know that.